March 1, 1969. When Jim Morrison stepped into the Miami courtroom, he knew his career was already over. 6 serious charges: indecent and obscene behavior, public exposure, obscene language. The prosecution had 16 witnesses, all swearing they saw everything that night at the Dinner Key Auditorium. But 8 other witnesses swore they saw nothing. For 40 years, the court records remained sealed, buried in a Miami basement. What really happened on that Coconut Grove stage wasn't just about Morrison getting drunk and losing control. It was about something darker, something the FBI had been waiting for since the Doors' first Ed Sullivan appearance. The case of James Douglas Morrison versus the state of Florida was not an obscenity case. It was an execution, and Morrison knew it the moment he saw the judge's face. 3 hours before that Miami concert, Morrison had received a phone call that would explain everything, but that call was never mentioned in court. Discovering why would change rock history forever. If you're curious about the true story behind Jim Morrison, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every week, we uncover the dark secrets of rock history. On the morning of March 1, 1969, around 11 o'clock, Morrison was alone in his hotel room. Pamela Corson was in Los Angeles, and the other band members were rehearsing. When the phone rang, Morrison was standing by the window with a bottle of whiskey, looking out over Miami Bay. When he answered, the voice on the other end was familiar, but unexpected. It wasn't an FBI official. The caller told Morrison, "If you go on stage tonight, you'll lose everything. If you want to protect your family, cancel the concert." When Morrison hung up, his hands were shaking, because it couldn't be a coincidence that the caller knew Morrison's father's name, rank, and office number at the Pentagon. Admiral George Stephen Morrison's son, Jim Morrison, had been estranged from his family for years. They never spoke, but the bond was still there, and someone was using that bond as a weapon. Morrison downed his whiskey. He wouldn't cancel the concert, because retreat was not in Morrison's character. But the real impact of that phone call was something else. When Morrison took the stage, he was no longer giving a free performance. He was walking into a trap. The FBI's file on Jim Morrison had been opened in September 1967. When the Doors appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, they performed "Light My Fire," but Morrison refused to change the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," during the live broadcast. Before the show, Ed Sullivan had asked Morrison to change the word "higher," which had drug connotations, to "better." Morrison appeared to agree, but when the cameras rolled, Morrison sang the original lyrics, witnessed by millions of American television viewers. After the show, Ed Sullivan announced he would never invite the Doors back. But the real problem wasn't Ed Sullivan. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was watching that performance. To Hoover, Morrison wasn't just a rock star. He was a symbol of the counterculture, the musical voice of the Vietnam War protests, the icon of a young generation defying authority. Hoover's memo included the sentence, "Morrison is dangerous. He should be kept under surveillance." The Miami stage 2 years later was the result of that surveillance. Late February 1969, the Doors were finishing their tour. Morrison had been drinking more and more over the last 6 months, becoming increasingly unpredictable on stage. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore were concerned, but couldn't stop Morrison. The Miami concert was actually going to be canceled. The Dinner Key Auditorium held 12,000 people, but ticket sales were poor, and the organizer was considering canceling the concert at the last minute. But a week before, tickets suddenly sold out. 12,000 people filled the hall to see Morrison. Organizer Ken Collier described this sudden interest as a miracle. But when the files were opened 40 years later, it emerged that 3,000 of those tickets had been sold as part of an operation coordinated by the Miami police. The FBI wasn't just watching Morrison, they were setting a trap. And for the trap to work, they needed a crowd. The more witnesses, the stronger the case. Morrison was walking to his own gallows when he went to Miami, but he didn't know it. Or maybe he knew and didn't care. Because there was something Morrison had said in the last few weeks. If they want to finish me off, let them finish me off. I'm tired. 7:30 p.m. on March 1st, 1969. The Dinner Key Auditorium was packed. 12,000 people were waiting, screaming, wanting Morrison to come on stage. But Morrison was finishing another bottle of whiskey backstage. Ray Manzarek opened the door and went inside. When he told Morrison, "It's time to go on stage," Morrison said, "I know," without opening his eyes. Manzarek would never forget the look on Morrison's face. It was as if Morrison knew that this night would be the end of his career. Manzarek would later say, "The emptiness in Jim's eyes scared me. That night, Jim Morrison wasn't on stage. Someone else was." When Morrison came on stage, the crowd went wild. But Morrison stood at the microphone and didn't start singing. He looked at the crowd. The silence stretched on. Then Morrison began to speak. "You are like sheep. You came to see me, but you don't know who I am. I don't know either." The crowd was stunned. Manzarek began to touch the organ keys, trying to play the intro to Break On Through. But Morrison didn't start the song. He continued talking. What exactly did Morrison do that night at the Dinner Key Auditorium? Even 40 years later, the answer is unclear, because half of the 12,000 people in that hall saw one thing, and half saw another. According to the witnesses presented by the prosecution in court, when Morrison came on stage, he was completely drunk, hurled insults, insulted the audience, and then pulled down his pants and exposed himself. 16 witnesses swore they saw this, but 8 witnesses found by the defense attorney said Morrison never took off his pants. Photographers took hundreds of pictures that night. In none of the photos does Morrison appear naked, but the prosecution claimed that the photographers missed the moment because Morrison only opened his pants for a few seconds and immediately put them back on. So what is the truth? Morrison was definitely drunk that night. There is no dispute about that. Concert recordings show what Morrison said. He used profanity, used harsh language with the audience, and said, "You're all a bunch of slaves." But the issue of nudity remains in a gray area. An interesting detail emerged when the court files were opened in 2009. 12 of the prosecution's 16 witnesses had met with Miami police a week before the concert. Why? Because the police had pre-identified people who could testify in a potential scandal. In other words, the witnesses were ready before the concert. The trap was set. Morrison stayed on stage for about 45 minutes that night. It wasn't really a concert. It was more of a performance art scandal. Morrison didn't sing "Light My Fire." He didn't sing "The End." Instead, he improvised, yelled at the audience, drank whiskey on stage. At one point, he sat on the edge of the stage and asked the crowd, "You want to see my cock?" The crowd screamed. Morrison held his shirt over his pants, made a move, but whether he actually unzipped his pants remains controversial. Half of the thousands who witnessed that moment said yes, half said no. But that didn't matter to the FBI, because what the FBI needed wasn't whether Morrison actually exposed himself. It was enough witnesses claiming he did, and 16 witnesses were enough. Before the concert ended, police barricades surrounded the venue. When Morrison returned to the dressing room, the arrest warrant was ready. But Morrison wasn't arrested that night, because the FBI wanted a bigger show. Instead of arresting Morrison there and then turning it into a national scandal would be more effective. The police waited. The media waited. And when Morrison returned from Miami to Los Angeles, everything was about to begin. 4 days later, Miami newspapers ran headlines reading, "Jim Morrison naked on stage. Rock star exposed himself in front of 12,000 people. No photos, no video, just witness statements." But that was enough for the media. Overnight, Morrison became one of America's most wanted men. The Miami prosecutor filed 6 charges: public indecency, obscene language, drunken performance, insulting the audience, disorderly conduct, and violating public morals. An arrest warrant was issued for Morrison while he was in a studio in Los Angeles. Instead of picking Morrison up from his home, FBI officials chose to arrest him at the airport in front of the media. Why? Because convicting Morrison wasn't enough. He had to be symbolically destroyed. The message to the rock music industry was this: push the boundaries, and the system will crush you. Morrison was handcuffed in front of cameras when arrested at the airport. Newspapers splashed the photos across their front pages. The Doors tours began to be canceled. Cincinnati, Detroit, Philadelphia, all concerts except one were canceled. Radio stations stopped playing the Doors songs. In one day, Morrison went from rock's biggest star to its biggest pariah. The court case lasted 8 months. Morrison returned to Miami and faced the jury. The prosecution presented 16 witnesses. Each said Morrison had exposed himself. The defense attorney found 8 witnesses. Each said Morrison had not taken off his pants. Photos were presented. None showed Morrison naked, but the prosecutor said this was not proof. The photographers missed the moment. What did the jury do? 8 of the 12 jurors found Morrison guilty. 4 said he wasn't guilty. Result: guilty. Sentence: 6 months in prison, a fine of $2,500. Morrison appealed, but the appeal process took years. During that time, Morrison fled to Paris, and he died in Paris. The appeal process was finalized after Morrison's death. The appeal was denied. Jim Morrison remained officially guilty, but the conviction was debated for 40 years. Because the court records were sealed, they were not public. The FBI file was classified. The truth was hidden. In 2009, something changed. Under the Freedom of Information Act, Morrison's FBI file was made public. 200 pages of documents. And the documents revealed the Miami concert was no coincidence. The FBI had been monitoring Morrison since 1967. J. Edgar Hoover had labeled Morrison a counterculture threat. A 1968 memorandum from Hoover stated, "Morrison is having a dangerous effect on young people. He should be punished as an example." The FBI was coordinating with the Miami police. Potential witnesses had been identified before the concert. During the concert, police barricades surrounded the venue. A media campaign was organized after the concert. Everything was planned. Morrison appearing on stage drunk that night and giving an uncontrolled performance was part of the plan. But the real plan was to find Morrison guilty and send a warning to the rock industry. Internal FBI correspondence clearly showed this. The Morrison case will bring discipline to the music industry. Other artists will learn the limits. Morrison's conviction was not just a legal decision. It was a propaganda operation. And it worked. After the Miami case, no rock star ever performed without limits like Morrison again. Censorship returned. Radio stations began censoring lyrics. Stages were subject to regulations. Morrison paid a heavy price. His career ended. Tours were canceled. Album sales plummeted. When Morrison fled to Paris, he distanced himself from music. He returned to writing poetry, but his addiction continued. And on July 3, 1971, Morrison was found dead in a bathtub in Paris. There was no autopsy. The cause of death was recorded as heart attack, but the truth was never revealed. Morrison's Miami conviction continued even after his death. The appeal was denied. Morrison's guilty status remained on official records for 40 years. In 2010, 39 years after Morrison's death, Florida Governor Charlie Crist made a decision. He would pardon Morrison. The decision was controversial. The Miami prosecutor's office objected. They did not want to reopen the court records, but Crist was determined. Crist's statement included the following sentence: Jim Morrison's Miami conviction was unjust. Witness statements were contradictory, evidence was insufficient, the process was politicized. Christ signed the pardon. Morrison was now officially innocent. But the pardon came too late. Morrison had been dead for 39 years. The pardon couldn't bring Morrison back. But the symbolic meaning of the pardon was important, because the pardon officially acknowledged the game the FBI had played. Morrison wasn't just a rock star, he was an artist fighting for freedom, and he fought the system. The system crushed Morrison. Morrison's Miami conviction will remain one of the darkest moments in rock history, because it wasn't just the downfall of an artist, it was a demonstration of how the power of the system could suppress artistic freedom. The contradictions between the court transcripts, FBI files, and witness statements that were kept hidden for 40 years have still not been fully resolved. Did Morrison really take off his pants that night? Maybe yes, maybe no. But that's not the real question. The real question is, how free is an artist when they take the stage? Morrison tested that question, and the answer was, freedom has a limit, and that limit is the line drawn by the FBI. Morrison crossed that line, and the price was heavy. Conviction, exile, death. But Morrison's legacy lives on, because Morrison paid the price for freedom. And rock history will never forget Morrison.